Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we are going to do basically the opposite of what we did yesterday, where we looked at the cards that I thought might be nerfed. Today we're going to look at the cards that I think might be buffed. Now with buffs, obviously it's harder than with nerfs, because there's plenty of cards that could be buffed. You know, there's a lot of different options you have, but the way I'm going to do this is, Steve Rubin, Riot Rubin Zoo, talked about his idea of, what if every balance patch or whatever, we just, took one champion from each region and buffed them. So what I'm going to do today is basically do just that, essentially, is go through all the regions, pick one champion out of those regions and say, what if we buff this one? And, just go from there. You guys can talk to me, about which champion in each region you would personally buff. Maybe you disagree, like, oh, I think this one would be a better option than that one. And, you might also disagree with the way I have buffed them. And then at the very end, we're just going to quickly wrap up with some likely candidates for, like, follower cards or spell cards that I think also could be buffed. So I thought that that would be a neat way of doing it. So let's dive in straight away with Vandal City. And obviously, when we come to Vandal City, the problem is that isn't many champions that, jump out as, like, these desperately need a buff. Fizz, possibly, but it's a very difficult champion, I think, to buff without, like, reworking kind of significantly what's going on. Tristana, obviously, will be one. I'm going to stick away from Tristana just because I think Tristana could be good by the time that all of Vandal City comes out. And obviously, I don't know, what multi-region followers will be coming into the game, but I suspect that there definitely will be some, and that Tristana, could be pretty good by, the end of the full set release. And then you look at the others and you're like, well, Teemo's fine, Lulu's fine, Ziggs is fine, Poppy's too good, Vega's fine. And so we come to Heimer, who's probably the least Vandal City champion of them all, but I will pick Heimer for this one, because Piltover Zone has multiple that needs buffing, and Heimer is one of them, so I thought that. Now, those of you who have stuck around for a while know my suggested Heimer change, and I do think that it is a very good change. But those of you who haven't seen this kind of thing before, this is my suggested change, is to change the 3-mana turret. We all know that Heimer used to be very good when the 3-mana turret was elusive, and don't worry, I'm not reverting it back to elusive, but instead I wish that this turret had lifesteal on it, because lifesteal, as we know from cards like Eye of the Dragon, really help in this kind of, play style. Heimer is one of those champions that you want to just stick around and just get like max value from, for a very long time, and the 3-mana turret was always the most sort of important one for Heimer. And Fearsome obviously is probably one of the worst keywords you could have, but Lifesteal would probably be like the second best one you could have. It's not as toxic as Elusive, the game isn't going to end straight away, it's instead going to help Heimer get into the frame of mind where instead of Heimer's down and they had double flash of brilliance, the game is over. It's Heimer's down, they have double flash of brilliance, the game is going to last longer. If I can't remove their Heimer, I'm in trouble. That's what it should be, and that's what Heimer to me should be as a champion as a whole. But instead, Heimer ended up as kind of either a combo way of winning the game or kind of useless. And I think that by giving him a 3-mana lifesteal turret instead, that is a good way of helping him kind of find his rightful place as a card that you want to remove very quickly. Otherwise, he's going to slowly take over the game, not he's going to very quickly take over the game and win it. So I think that would be a great change. And you can move Fearsome to the T-Hex. Don't know why it doesn't have a keyword anyway. Feels like it probably should. And I would have no, I don't think anyone would doubt that having Fearsome on T-Hex as the new keyword for it after you remove this would be a good idea. So that's my Heimer change. I do think this one would be very positive for all you Heimer lovers out there. Moving on to Bilgewater, and we have some choices. Obviously, I've just mentioned Fizz and how I think he's difficult. It's Fortune, obviously not. Nami, definitely not. Pyke, probably not. Pyke's fine. Tom Kench, maybe. Twisted Fate and Gangplank, probably not. And then Nautilus. So my two choices really were between Tom Kench and Nautilus. And overall, it was a very tough call. But I think I went with Tom Kench because, we just haven't really seen any support for Tom Kench and his whole archetype for a very long time. So I thought maybe it's time to touch up on Tom Kench. And I was wondering how to buff Tom Kench because I haven't played a lot of Tom Kench Soraka. And so I was kind of in a bit of a weird spot where I was like, how could you really buff this card, without making it a real problem? And I think the way to do it is probably make Acquired Taste cost 1. Just make it so the protection for Tom Kench is a bit better. I think this would be a pretty significant buff, but I think that kind of deck needs a pretty significant buff for people to be like, yeah, let's play this. This is going to be good now. And I don't mind that deck, and I feel like that deck was missing something. And I think, often, whether it was Star Spring or whatever, Tahm Kench was obviously kind of a prime win condition in that deck. But I think that this would really make Tahm Kench, like a really, really big threat with the 1 mana Quiet Taste. Another thing you could do, and I wouldn't mind this either, is make Bayo Brunch 2 mana instead. Just to kind of go in for more of a different kind of game plan. Maybe figures like this being like a good card would be an interesting thing, I think. This card has a lot of potential to do very interesting things that we haven't really seen. I think because it's a 3 mana slow spell. If this was a 2 mana fast speed spell, there's a lot of interesting things you could do with this card all of a sudden, and it would be a really cool card to build around, I think. And I'm almost intrigued to see what that would look like. So this is another option, I think, that you could really go with, is buffing Bayo Brunch to a point where it's like you would definitely play this card anytime you're playing Tahm Kench. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. And, we've seen, that it would, I think, help as well with obviously what, like, this archetype with stuff like Boxtopus, is kind of going for, is that, you could use Bayo Brunch on, like, a Tahm Kench, and when Tahm Kench levels up, he'll then spit him back out, and he'll be a 3/4. That was, I think, kind of the point, but we never really saw it that much. But I do think that would be a very, very interesting thing to sort of try and see what goes on. Maybe the fast speed would be a bit too much, but definitely a reduce in mana cost would be quite interesting, I think. Moving on to Demacia, and we have some choices here, of course. I mean, maybe you could consider Fiora in there. I think Lucian, Poppy, Siobhan probably is just about okay. Garen, obviously, very much an option. I know a lot of people would argue for Quinn. Jarvan maybe even is considerable as well. But I am going to go for Lux, because I think Lux is a very popular character and has not seen play in a lot of time. And I think there's a lot of different interesting ways that you can buff Lux and be pretty safe in the knowledge that nothing is going to be broken. I've seen a lot of people offer up different Quinn buffs and ideas and suggestions, and I think that a lot of people forget that Scout is a very, very powerful keyword, especially in a region with good combat tricks, because obviously if you, for instance, let's say Quinn, for whatever reason, you decided Quinn needs a massive buff, let's make her a 5/5. You get this 5/5 with a Valor as well, summoned. Obviously, this would never happen, but, just go with me. And then you play a Sharp Sight on Quinn, and now you've got the 7/7, and you can challenge their unit, and you're hitting them with a 7/7 twice. You can quickly understand how Scout is a very powerful keyword, and, people need to be more careful with Quinn, I think. I don't think people realize how easily it is for, Quinn to be pretty broken very quickly. So I've gone with Lux because I think that it's a much safer option. One thing I've always said about Lux, and I do still think this would be a good change, is making it so that the spell mana carries over, when she gets a final spark. So what I mean by that is, say you cast an 8 mana spell, that then you would only need, you'd get the final spark, of course, but then you'd only need 4 mana to then get another final spark. You wouldn't need anything else. That is it. And I think that would be a very positive change overall for Lux. And, people have brought up, well, would that mean changing LeBlanc as well? And yeah, why not change LeBlanc as well? I don't see a reason why she should be stopped from getting mirror images in the first place. I think that it would be a positive change for both champions, and any champions that come out in the future that have this kind of similar, very static thing where they have to get exactly an amount. It seems very odd to me. So that's what I would do, is I would carry it over, and at that point I would also make the final spark deal 5. Just because I feel like we're at that point now where the final spark should feel like, it's going to deal with even more threats than perhaps it should. And I think that would be a good thing overall. So final spark dealing 5 and the spell mana carrying over, I think would be overall a good change for Lux, and just help her find, potentially a deck or two that she can thrive in. Because a big problem with Lux, I think, at the moment is, one of the best spells in Demacia is Concerted Strike. And you're always going to play Concerted Strike in a Lux deck, but it's a 5 mana spell. So you're committing that 5 mana, and then most likely you're going to be committing, at least like probably like a 3, 4, 5 mana spell again, and then you're only getting one final spark for it, and that's just going to feel really bad because you're not really going to play 1 mana spells, so you're just not being that efficient as you could be But with this version of Lux, you wouldn't have to worry about it. Onto Freljord, and, you know, again, some options in here. Obviously, Tryndamere, maybe a Nivea. Braum, obviously considerable. And I am going to go with Braum. And I'm doing it, my friends. I am doing it. I am reverting Braum back to a 1-5. Here we go again. I do think that this should be done. And I know some of you are probably screaming in the comments at me like, what are you doing? Here's why I think this should be done. I think we're at the point now where it's okay. I really, really do. I think Vandal City in particular, it was, you know, a significant power creep came into the game, and I think that now Braum would be okay. Sure, am I taking Braum from one of the worst champions in the game to potentially like a top 10 champion in the game? Yes, I am. Am I okay with that? Yes, because I do not think that Braum would be in the top 5. I do not think that. You know, you think about, like, if your opponent plays Poppy and you play Braum and they've got a full board and they attack with Poppy, Braum can't even block Poppy with his 1-5 stat line, and they're getting a buff on all of their other units as well. You would be significantly behind. Another good thing that Braum does, though, if you do make Braum one of the better champions, is Braum will slow the game down a bit. Not a massive amount, you know, not to the point where, you know, every game is a control matchup, but Braum would slow it down a bit. And I think the game is a bit too quick. And I think, you know, based off what the devs have said, they agree that the game is a bit too quick, could be slowed down a bit. And I think that making Braum one of the better champions of the game would be a good way of doing that. Braum deals with a lot of things, you know, things like Ping City, you know, like things that, you know, just deal a lot of one. Braum is good at surviving that. Braum is a counter to that, and we haven't seen too many things like that. And I admit that Braum would be strong, but I do not think he would be so strong. And one of the reasons that Braum was so strong back in the day is that there was not many ways of, you know, dealing that, ever killing Braum, really. We have more ways now. You know, Culling Strike was obviously your best option back in the day. Probably still would be the best option today. But there are others as well. You know, there are more spells now that deal 4 damage, whereas back in the day it was literally Flock. And I think that that was a big problem. Is that back in the day, really, the only regions that could deal with Braum efficiently was basically Noxus. You know, when he was a 1-5, it was basically just Noxus. Now we have more things, so that if Braum attacked one of your units, even with one attack, you would have, you know, multiple spells that could deal 4 damage at least, and, you know, potentially kill Braum. And I think that that would be pretty important. And so I think that it would be okay for Braum to be one of the better champions of the game. I don't know why we think that, you know, these worst champions of the game need to be, you know, improved only to mid-table. Why can't they be top 10? I don't know. I would do it. I think it would be good for the game overall. It would slow it down a bit. It would give Freljord a powerhouse. It would potentially see the return of, you know, different control decks, you know, Freljord control decks into the meta, and that would be, in my mind, pretty interesting. And there would also be more things going on as well. You'd get Scargrounds decks and things like that as well coming out with Braum. There'd be a lot of experimentation with Braum all of a sudden in a bunch of different decks that you could run Braum in, and I think that that would be very good overall for the game. Moving on to Ionia, and tough one. You know, Irelia, I don't think we'd see the buff of Irelia necessarily. Maybe the deck, we'll get into that in a bit. But the actual Irelia card herself, maybe not. Lulu, probably fine. Zed is like, you know, if Zed ever gets buffed, it's going to be a tricky time, because how on earth do you buff Zed? Shen is probably fine. Yasuo, consideration. Karma, and probably fine. And Lee Sin, let's never buff Lee Sin again. So I am going to go with Yasuo, but Yasuo is such a difficult champion to buff. You know, you're not really going to make the stats any bigger at this point. You know, a 4-mana 4/4 with quick attack is probably as big as you're willing to go. You could change, you know, ideal 3 to it instead of 2. That's something that I did consider and think about. And that is a possibility, and I wouldn't be necessarily against that either. My problem with Yasuo is buffing Yasuo always feels like, you know, you have to buff other cards, but because I'm buffing champions, I will have to focus on Yasuo. So yeah, my 2 options basically are deal 3 to it, or I did think on Yasuo's leveled up thing, you know, when he says I strike it, you could add something like, you know, if I don't kill it, stun it next round, you know, something like that, so that then he would get to second strike it kind of thing, you know, so that leveled up Yasuo becomes a real threat. It's possible, right? It's something that you could do. I'm not in love with either change, if I'm honest, Because I feel like, yes, to buff Yasuo, you know, what Yasuo would really need is a tutor for Yasuo, you know, something that draws Yasuo in his deck. Perhaps another champion that, you know, is really concerned with stunning things as well would be quite nice. And just more good stun cards in general coming out for Yasuo, you know, maybe some extra followers and things like that that are really quite strong for Yasuo as well. I feel like those kind of things are more needed than a buff to Yasuo himself to be good, but I don't know. If you do have a good Yasuo change, let me know. On to Noxus, and again, some options here. Obviously, Katarina jumps out at you, you know, Vlad probably as well. Maybe even Riven, maybe Darius. But I am, again, for those of you who watch this channel for a long time, I'm very sorry that you have to hear this again, but I'm sick and tired of people saying that Katarina needs a rework. I just don't believe it. I just really don't believe it. I think Katarina is really fun. And I think when you have a fun champion, try your best to find a way to not rework it. That's basically my idea, is Katarina, when leveled up and when going off and you get to rally multiple times in the same round, I think is a lot of fun. In fact, I think it's one of the most fun ways to play the game. It's a shame that she's bad, but I do think that when it goes off, it's insanely fun when Katarina wins a game for you. So I think unless you're talking about reworking like a champion spell, which is very possible, which I wouldn't mind, I wouldn't rework Katarina at all. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Take away the Fleeting Blade's Edge, make Katarina 2 mana in this form, keep that 4 mana, and I think you have a very playable champion. I really do, because the problem with Katarina is you sacrifice the 3 mana, maybe even 4 if you play the Blade's Edge, to do very little, essentially. You're going to attack with Katarina on turn 3, and, you know, then you're going to have no board. Turn 3 is a really important turn. Often, your 3-drop will live a long time. Your 2-drops, not so often. You know, your 2-drops will probably trade up pretty quick in most games, but your 3-drop will, you know, normally stick around quite a bit, or trade with another 3-drop or something like that. 3-drops are quite powerful in this game and are pretty important in this game, and that is why Katarina struggles, because she's such a big tempo loss. On turn 2, however, I don't think that same thing could be said. You could play a 1-drop into a 2-drop Katarina, get Katarina leveled up, you've still got that 1-drop on the board, and then you can potentially play a sturdy 3-drop, and all of a sudden, you know, you're looking okay. You know, let's say that it's a Yeti type deck, right? So you play Yeti Yearling on turn 1, Katarina on turn 2, you level up Katarina already. You play Avarice and Trapper on turn 3. Let's say you get the Yeti next turn. Now you've got a 5/5, and then you go from there. And all of a sudden you're building this board, right? And you've always got this threat of, I can rally on any turn, be careful what you do. You know, if you tap out or something, I'm going to rally on you. I've always got something to do. That's what Katarina is meant to represent, but it's never come to fruition because she's too much of a mana sink. And so I would make her 2 mana, because as soon as you've got that threat of Katarina, I can, you know, do this at any point, and Katarina obviously once leveled up is pretty much a free attack, you know, at least with Katarina herself. That's when she becomes interesting. That is when she can become playable, and I do think it would work. And I hope one day that Riot sees me saying this and will just try it. Just try it. Just please make Katarina 2 mana. We know a 2 mana 3/2 with Quick Deck isn't going to break the game. Lucian has already been that forever. So we know that would be fine. There would be no problems there. So everything in my mind would be fine. The rally is still 4 mana. Obviously, you can't make this 3 mana because then you could attack 4 times in one turn, and that just wouldn't be fair. But this would be fine. This is fine. Please, please, Riot, do it. Please, for the love of God, just try it. Just let me see it. Let me see it. Maybe it would be too good. I don't know. I highly doubt it. I really highly doubt it. I think it would make an effect. I think Katarina would become playable, certainly as like a one-off in certain decks. And that's all we need. That's all we need. Please do it. Please do it. And I'm sorry for all of you who have had to hear me say this, because I had that idea about a year ago now, and I've just been saying it over and over and over and over again. I'm very sorry. Moving on to Piltover Zone, and again, some options here, definitely some options. You know, maybe people would even consider Caitlyn. I don't think Caitlyn's at that level, but definitely Echo, right? Definitely Victor. Heimer we've already touched on as well, and maybe even Vi would be in consideration as well. But I think overall, I am going to go for Echo. This one I think is pretty easy. Obviously, you could make Echo a 4/3. It's very possible, you know, do that. Why not? I think one thing I would do is make these not fleeting time tricks. I think we can all agree that that would be a good idea, because then at least Echo would have a good purpose. You know, Echo would then be like again, following on in a kind of similar way of, he's just going to give you a lot of value long term. You're not going to run out of cards if you get these free time tricks all the time. There would also be a good reason to level him up. Now you're getting free time tricks to use whenever you want. There would be something there. Maybe even like a Twisted Fate draw deck. That could be really interesting. With Echo, a kind of, control version almost of this kind of thing. I could see it. Why not? It would be interesting in the very least. Though there's always things that you can do when you can predict and draw cards. That will always be possible. So I think that it would make Echo a ton better, and would make him more interesting straight away as well, because there'd be a lot more options to play Echo with. So that's that. It would also help Echo level up as well. That's another thing. There isn't enough predict in Piltover and Zorn. Well, if he gets time tricks that, will always be there, the good thing is that you could probably, predict your second Echo even if the first one dies. And it would be a good way of getting more predicts in Piltover and Zorn. So even helping him level up as well. Onto the Shadow Isles, and again we have potentially multiple options here. Callista, Maokai, Nocturne, Kindred, Hecarim probably as well. The rest are probably okay. But the one I have gone for is Kindred. Kindred obviously has been... Whoa. Oh dearie me, Kindred. Poor Kindred. Completely got outclassed. And honestly, I don't think anyone has a good solution for Kindred. I think that that's the thing, that no one really knows what Kindred needs. I'll be honest, I have not seen any suggestion for Kindred that I've been like, yes, that would be a good one. The one I've gone with is something very experimental, and I don't know if it would work or not. It might be too strong. I don't know, because I just have not seen any good option for Kindred. So let me know what you think of this one, because I'm very intrigued. But I would change weakest to strongest and see what happens. I would make Kindred a 4-3 and make weakest to strongest. So a bit of a stat nerf for the option of, killing something very important, potentially. I think that that is a good change. Kindred easier to remove, but basically would say, if you don't remove me, you're in trouble. A lot of trouble. Because removing your strongest enemy each turn, that's a strong ability, right? That is worth playing. And all of a sudden, I think you could start to see, control lists that play Kindred that would make sense. Removing the strongest enemy is definitely an effect that's worth trying to do. And so I think Kindred would become a good option. You would be moving maybe slightly away from, you'd sort of be giving up that Thresh is a better option in the Slay deck, which we all kind of accept now anyway. But Kindred might find his own home. Kindred might find his own kind of controlled shell that would make sense, particularly in certain metas. Would make a lot of sense depending on what decks you were coming up against a lot of. So I think that would be a good change. That would, probably help Kindred quite a lot. And I don't think it'd be too strong. I think that it would need the stat nerf as well. Just to make it so that, Kindred couldn't dominate the game, just to make him easier to remove in general. So I do think that that would be a possibility, but I do think that Kindred all of a sudden would become like a champion that you'd be like, ooh, let's try this. There's plenty of different control decks that you could try it with, and I think that would be a good option. On to Shurima, and this one was very easy for me because I'm just going to pick Renekton, and I'm just going to change his level up to 10 damage so that, when you attack and then, if you could block on the next round, then Renekton levels up. That's all we really need. That's all I've ever, all I ever wanted was to see you smiling. That's exactly all Renekton needs, and I think that that would be a very helpful change overall. So, why was this ever 12? Let's be real. Make it 10. As it always should have been, and see where it goes. Maybe Renekton would still need another buff after that, but at the very least, it would feel like you could level Renekton much more reliably. And finally, we come to Targon, and again, obviously, a lot of different options we could go for here. Maybe Diana, Aphelios, Rocca, maybe even Leona, maybe even Taric, Malphite, Asol. All good options, really. Almost all of them good options. But the one I've gone for is Leona. And, those of you who watched my How Bad is Daybreak thing, I was kind of like, Daybreak isn't, it's not that far off. I do think another Daybreak champion would be a big buff to Leona. But in the meantime, whilst we're doing that, I would like to add on to Leona's leveled up form, when I stun an enemy, grant me one extra, +1/+1. The reason I like that is because it kind of feels like she's harnessing the power of the sunlight. It feels like it fits thematically. It's kind of similar to Diana, where she's getting extra attack. Like, it kind of feels kind of similar in scope. It's kind of the yin to the yang. So I feel like that would be a good change overall. It would also give, like, Leona a good reason for you to put the Zenith Blade on Leona. I think that makes sense. And so, yeah, that's what I would do with Leona. I think that would help Daybreak out a lot. But I am going to bend the rules slightly because also I would just like to quickly say, yes, let's revert ASOL. Many people have said this, and I don't see why not, right? Let's just revert ASOL. That would be fine. And I have no problem with it. And so that is all the champions, but I just very quickly want to talk about potentially some followers and things like that I could see buffed. We have seen Ruben talk about regional power level, and he mentioned Freljord and Targon as potentially the two weakest regions. Well, I quickly kind of went through each of the regions here, and I was thinking, what could they buff? What would I not be surprised if they did buff? And I would not be surprised in Freljord if they kind of lent back in to things like Wording Stones. This used to be a 0/4 and was quite strong. As a 0/4, and I wouldn't be shocked if this is the kind of thing that they were going for again. Revert this back to a 0/4. It is strong, don't get me wrong, but as I said before, we have more ways of dealing 4 damage now. There are more ways of potentially getting rid of cards like this, or out-tempoing a card like this. And so I wouldn't be shocked if that's the kind of way they went with it. And potentially other things, stuff like Avaros and Marksman. This card has always been a 3/1. I don't know why. It definitely could be a 3/2 at this point. And, this again, kind of just giving them like a generically, better card, like a decent card all of a sudden, potentially Ezreal decks could use this and things like that. I think would be very helpful as well. So things like Avaros and Marksman, things like Wording Stones, I think that these are the kind of things that they'll be looking to buff in Freljord that will, just give them that identity, particularly something like Wording Stones, would be a big sort of identity card for them to go and buff. And I think that would be a big kind of thing for them to say, yes, Freljord ramp control is back on the menu. Quickly skimming on over to Ionia, they have also mentioned that, with all of the changes, with the flawless duet costing 2 and all that, it's probably, okay to revert some of the old Blade Dance changes. So, things like Blossoming Blade potentially, or, some of the other cards in there as well. I could definitely see them, kind of reverting some of those. They've mentioned it. And I think that would be fine, right? I think we're at the point now where, as the Irelia is kind of not bad, but, clearly significantly worse than it was before. And I think, just reverting 1 or 2 of those cards, I would not be surprised if they did that. And then moving on into Targon, they have mentioned how, the nerfs to Pale Cascade and Stalking Shadows particularly hit Nightfall, even though, that wasn't the intention of hitting both those cards. Obviously, those cards were both very strong just generally anyway. And so, nerfing them does and did make sense. And so, I think we are expecting potentially, the odd Nightfall card to change as well. I don't know what Nightfall cards it will be, but I would expect that, I don't think it'd be something like Crescent Guardian. I actually don't know what it would be exactly, maybe, I don't know, how can you buff this? Like, there are difficult things to go on here. Again, how do you buff this? So I'll be interested to see how they buff Nightfall, but I would expect them to buff Nightfall in some way. Maybe my hope would be potentially that it's the Evershade Stalker, because this is an interesting card that I wish was kind of better, because you can do more than just Nightfall with this card. And so I'd kind of, this would be my choice if I could choose any. But definitely buffs to Nightfall I think are coming. And I think also another thing they could buff within Targon is the Landmark package, right? Obviously Malphite's Landmark package is horrendous and always has been horrendous. And so I do think that it would be a good thing for them to, maybe look at some of these cards, like Spiral Stairs in particular, and look at making this like an actual playable card that is pretty good rather than absolute trash. And I think that would be a good thing overall. So, Landmark changes and Nightfall changes I would expect. And if you go through all of my changes, because I know a lot of people complain about Targon, if you look at all the changes that I've made, we're making Nightfall better. So Diana better. Maybe you could even argue that makes Aphelios better as well. Let's call it even. I'm making Tahm Kench better, which probably makes Soraka better. I've buffed Leona. I'm buffing Malphite as well because of the Landmark changes, and ASOL is getting a buff as well. So basically, half the champions, more than half the champions in Targon would get a buff if my patch notes were the real patch notes. You know, more than half of the champions in Targon would be getting either a direct or indirect buff, and I think that, you know, most people would be on board that that's probably a good thing. And so, with that said, that is me done talking about the buffs that, you know, I somewhat expect some of them to come in, and, you know, I'm very interested to see what you think about my ideas. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and have a really, really nice day.